I'm Chris Spencer. I'm the president of the Methodist Foundation of Louisiana, and just wanted to welcome everybody this afternoon to our tax seminar for church staff and administrators. Joining us today again this year is the Reverend Nate Berneking, who is the Director of Finance and Administrative Ministries for the Missouri Annual Conference. Nate is an attorney who practiced in corporate law, and Nate also has an MDiv from Emory University's Candler School of Theology, and he was a pastor before joining the staff, or I guess being appointed, Nate, to the staff of the Missouri Annual Conference. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A section, and Nate will address them as he goes. We are recording the webinar, and it will be posted on our website next week. So if you know somebody who couldn't make it today, please encourage them to come watch. Just a few more reminders for actually updates before I turn it over to Nate. We are also hosting Best Practices for the Church Office in May, featuring a veteran church administrator and member of our board, Diane Wilkinson, who is also on the webinar today. Diane, thank you so much for your time and your commitment to these webinars, these workshops that will be coming up in May. And you'll see on your screen now the dates and locations around the state. They'll be from 10 a.m. to noon with lunch afterwards at no cost. But we do ask that you register so that we can keep a good tally and for knowing how many lunches to order. We are excited about hosting these, and I guess this is the first time, Diane, that we've done these since before the pandemic. So we know we'll have a great turnout in these 5 locations around the state here in May. So we hope Nate's
That's the difference between someone well qualified as Nate. There's a registration fee. To see me, you get a free lunch and it doesn't cost anything. So
there you go. There you go. Well, we hope Nate's presentation will be beneficial to everyone. And thank you, Nate, for joining us this afternoon. I will now turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Now I feel all this pressure all of a sudden, like you had to pay for this. So thank you, everybody. I think a few folks were on this morning. Welcome back to those folks, and welcome to anybody who's joining us now for the afternoon session. Let me give you a little bit of a roadmap. We've got until I think 2:30 this afternoon, so that should be plenty of time. I tell Kelly when we organize these, it's like way more than what other organizations give me. So I can kind of go slowly, and we can take our time, and I can answer a lot of questions. So I can give you a roadmap. I'll say this at the outset. If you have a question as I'm going along, I'm going to be using slides and sharing my screen some. I may jump over to a couple of other things on my screen, some websites that might be helpful for you to know about as you do your ministries. But that said, I try to watch the chat, and if you have a question in the moment, you can feel free to put it in the chat, and I will try to get to it. That usually works pretty good. And at different points in the presentation, I will just pause and I'll stop sharing my screen. We'll go to this kind of panel here, and if you have a question, you are welcome to ask it either in chat or out loud. You can use your little icon to raise your hand, and I'll make sure that I get you. So I am going to start with kind of an introduction to legal issues, and I want to say this, I want to start in really big, broad terms. Legal issues with respect to a local church, and this could be applied to any ministry that you may have. I think there are a couple of key things for non-lawyers to remember in kind of addressing and being able to account for the legal issues within their local church or their ministry. The first is you have to give legal issues attention. You can't. So I said this in my devotion. It's not up to you to say no to programmatic ministries. It's not up to you to say no to your staff or your pastor. And however, it is up to you to make sure the legal issues involved have adequate attention and eyes. And it may be your attention. It may be that you need to encourage the pastor and work with the pastor to bring in other folks. Oh, do I have a question already? Will presentation material be available for review of printing? I believe the answer is yes, but that would be a question for Kelly. Kelly, you can share my materials with folks if they would like them. So you will want to give attention to legal issues or invite into conversation other lay leadership in the congregation with the pastor. Don't exclude your pastor. Even if you're upset with him or her, don't cut them out. They are appointed to the local church for a reason. You've got to include them in these conversations, but you may need to say, hey, I think there are some legal issues involved in what we're thinking about. And I think here are some folks that would be good to have in conversation with us. That's a whole lot more I can say when I was a pastor, I took that input a whole lot better than anybody telling me, no, I couldn't do something. In fact, I said, I struggle with humility. If I was told no, usually my response to getting no was, well, to do it anyway. So be creative in inviting those conversations, but no, legal issues need attention. And it may be, or you may be the only person who thinks to say, hey, we need to think about X, Y, or Z. The second thing I would say about legal issues is that they also need intentionality. So you have to pay attention to them and you have to deal with them intentionally. You can't just sort of, you can't allow them to, they don't always work themselves out for the best. So actually I just had a conversation early this morning before we started and yesterday afternoon with a local church that has a kind of a minor employment issue. And the pastor, who's a friend of mine, said, like, can I just not do anything? And my response was, well, sure, you can not do something, but if you don't do something, it may make the problem a lot worse than the problem you're envisioning that could happen if you do actually do something. You've got to be intentional. So I'll be the first to acknowledge a United Methodist clergy, sometimes their first instinct is, if my first instinct is to barrel ahead and just knock people down and run them over to get things done. A lot of United Methodist clergy, their instinct is maybe to pretend like problems don't exist. And that is a recipe for disaster. And so you, again, if you're the business administrator, if you're the financial secretary, if you're an executive pastor in a local church, you may need to be the one to say, hey, we've got to address this. And again, doesn't mean that you become a pinch point for ministry. It's simply, we may need to address this in order to get done what we think we need to get done. So be aware of both those. Those are actually, if you take nothing else away from my presentation today, be intentional and give it attention. If you get a letter from the IRS, don't ignore it. It could be a problem if you ignore it. Whatever it is, attention and intentionality. I have a list of do's and don'ts. I share these with my churches in Missouri pretty frequently. First of all, legal do's and don'ts. Do identify a leader with some know-how. If you have attorneys in your congregation, even if they are not in an elected position of leadership, even if you are not on some kind of retainer with them, even if they are just have somebody that knows something that you can call with a question or that can help you to be as attentive as you need to be. You need someone with know-how if you feel as though you don't have the know-how. If you do have the know-how, then you're the someone that has to be the leader to deal with these issues. And this is huge. It's hard, but do actually read legal documents. Or at the very least, get someone who knows how, mostly an attorney, to read them, all of them. Do not let a legal document, do not just sign your name to a document without reading it. Do not sign don't sign on behalf of a church to something you have not read and you need to understand it in addition to reading it. There are in a something like a copier lease, the print is going to be tiny. You're going to have to find a way to blow it up, but you need to understand what you're signing up for. When does it renew? How does it renew? When do I have to give notice if I don't want to renew? What if there's a problem with it? What happened? You need to understand what's in that document before you go signing the church up for it or signing the church to obligate the church to something. Stay informed of your church's legal relationships. Do stay informed. And by that, here's what I mean. A copier lease is a legal relationship. You have a relationship now with a vendor who's providing that lease to you. If you are renting space or you're renting out space, you either have a landlord or you have a tenant. That's a legal relationship. You need to stay informed of what the nature of those relationships and where they stand. All of them. Your employees in a local church, that is a legal relationship. You need to be aware of the nature of that relationship and how it's working. That doesn't mean you're the supervisor. It doesn't mean that you participate in evaluations, but you need to know when somebody is getting ready to resign, or if the church is gonna hire somebody new. You need to be aware of the relationships that exist. Do create systems of accountability that someone actually monitors. For the accounting office, it is a separation of duties. That's a system of accountability. The same person that books the check is not the person who writes the check, is not the person who actually delivers the check. You separate it out so that multiple people know where the expense is, so that no one person can write a check to themselves, book it as something else, and be able to pay themselves. Even honest people sometimes end up as perpetrators of financial fraud if they get in a desperate situation. You need systems of accountability. The same with your contracts. We're going to talk about that. You got a copier lease. You need to know when it's going to end and how it works. All your vendor contracts. You need systems of accountability around that so that things don't just hang out there. Do maintain good files. Keep documents. They can be digital. They don't have to be hard copies anymore. If you have a digitizing system, a scanning system, that's fine. But keep good files. Know where your insurance policies are. All of them for all times. If you need insurance, never throw away an insurance policy. You can scan it and shred the document, but keep the scanned document. Know where it is, know how to find it, and that way, when there's an issue and you need to find it, you can get to it very quickly. If, God forbid, the church ever ends up in litigation, I can tell you right now, all of the files related to the issue are going to end up in the hands of whoever is bringing the lawsuit. You will have to turn them over, or at least turn copies of them over. Don't have a mess. A mess looks horrible to judges and juries. Have good files. Know where things are. Be able to pull them very quickly. It will save you so much heartache in the future if you do that. And then I got some don'ts. Don't pretend you know more than you do. Be attentive, but don't pretend like you're a lawyer if you're not a lawyer. Go find a lawyer. Find the expert that you need to help you do the work that you need to do. Don't procrastinate, especially when it comes to legal issues. Do not get a letter from the IRS that says you have 30 days to respond and wait 29 days. That is a recipe for disaster. Don't procrastinate. I know that sometimes legal issues are painful, especially if, God forbid, you get served in a lawsuit, get served a subpoena. You cannot wait. You have got to move on it quickly, and you need to get in an expert who can help you respond in the way you're supposed to respond. Don't procrastinate. I cannot tell you the number of times when I get calls from a local church where they tell me about an issue and I ask a clarifying question about the timing, thinking that it has happened in the last 24 hours, only to be told, actually, it was a month ago that this happened. That is not helpful because we have lost a month's worth of time. Memory is fragile. It fades very quickly, and you can look it up online. Human beings can create memories that aren't there. Don't procrastinate. Be on top of legal issues. Don't assume that everything is just going to work out. I don't want to tell you to be a pessimist, but be a realist. Without attention, things do not work out for the good all the time. Sometimes if we don't give a little bit of help to them, they don't work out at all. They work out disastrously. So please, these are my legal do's and don'ts. Put this on, if you're the executive or the business administrator, quite honestly, even if you're pastor, print this slide off and put it up in your office somewhere, tape it to the wall, tape it to where you can see it. Follow these do's and don'ts. They are absolutely critical to addressing things the right way. All right. That's in general terms. With that in mind, that's the lens I want you to see everything, all legal issues through that you ever deal with in a local church. Those do's and don'ts and that attention and intentionality. I want you to make sure that you're looking through all of these issues through that lens. So I'm going to start out. And I'll just say this is going to be probably the biggest portion of my talk this afternoon. It's because this is my wheelhouse. This is my area of expertise. When I practiced law, I was in a corporate and transactions group. I did mergers and acquisitions. I worked for a lot of nonprofits. I know corporate law pretty well, and I know tax law, not quite as well as corporate law, but I know enough to be more than dangerous. And so I'm going to spend a good bit of time talking about local churches. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of shape this up in terms of a church as a tax exempt entity that sometimes isn't as exempt from tax as we think it is. Sometimes churches are not exempt. A lot of clergy have this idea that because the United States has the First Amendment, which does protect the free exercise of religion, a lot of our clergy imagine that because that First Amendment, churches can do whatever they want. They don't have to follow the laws that other organizations and companies have to follow. And that's true some of the time, but it's not true all of the time. And there are legal steps that churches need to take and know how to take in order to make sure that they're safe, that their members are safe, that their employees and their pastors are safe. So we're going to start out talking about these corporate and tax issues. The first thing I want to talk about is corporate law. You have probably heard this phrase, either not-for-profit or nonprofit corporations. Let me be clear. A nonprofit corporation is not necessarily a tax-exempt organization. However, good news, we'll talk about this. In the world of the church, especially the United Methodist Church, our churches may well be both a nonprofit corporation and they are always a tax-exempt organization, at least at the federal income tax level. And I'll talk about that. But a nonprofit corporation is a state law governed legal description of an organization that has taken some steps to organize itself. Let me explain what I mean. Let's step out of the world of nonprofit and churches, and let's step into the world of a hot dog stand. And let's say I am a master at making hot dogs. And I decide I'm going to make some money at this. I'm going to open a hot dog stand in my town. And I do that. I do it as an individual. I own the stand as an individual. I sign all the contracts necessary as an individual. I get a license from the city where I live to sell hot dogs from a stand as an individual. I do the cooking. I dress the hot dogs. I serve them over to the people that buy them, and they pay me for it. And my business is going pretty well. I'm making some money selling hot dogs until I get a bad batch of hot dogs. And several people get sick. and maybe even some of those people die. And the families of those people who got sick or they died, they bring a lawsuit. And here's what a lawsuit is. A lawsuit is only a notice to the courts in my state that says, we need you, court, to determine whether or not the hot dog seller is responsible for the illness and death. And if responsible, are we entitled to some kind of compensation? That's what a lawsuit is. A lawsuit is a request of a court to decide an issue. It sounds scary. It can be and is scary, but it is really a person asking for some kind of determination from the courts. Well, those folks go to court. I own the stand. I ran the stand. I am the only person that can be brought into court. And if it is determined that actually I didn't cook them properly, I was negligent in the way I did it, I might have to pay compensation. I might be responsible and then have to pay compensation to the victims. And if I have to do that, if I owned everything as an individual, it comes out of my pocketbook, my personal account. I have to compensate them. Or if I don't have enough, they can get what's called a judgment against me, and they can do things like garnish my future wages or put a hold on my assets. Well, back 100 years ago or so, a little longer, business owners realized that was not a very helpful way to do business. It was a really risky way to do business because sometimes you can't help but somebody getting hurt. Sometimes you can't help but have a bad batch of hot dogs. And so the states came up with something called a corporation. Now that you get talked about in the media all the time. Here's what a corporation is. It's a construct. It is the law of your state that says if someone or someone's plural goes into business, they can file a document under state law called Articles of Incorporation. And that will create, in the eyes of the courts and the eyes of the state and the eyes of everybody else, an entity, a construct. And it is no longer me individually that owns the hot dog stand. I form a corporation, and the corporation owns the stand. The corporation is responsible for the hot dogs. The corporation gets the license. All I do is I invest and own the corporation. I own stock in it. Okay? So if you own stock, whether it's in Coca-Cola or whatever company it is, you own a portion of that. But if Coca-Cola sends out a bad batch of soft drinks and people get sick, you, as one of the shareholders, as an owner of stock, you aren't responsible for that. The corporation is. Now, they may lose money and it hurts your investment, but you're not personally responsible for that. The same with my individual hot dog stand. If I have a corporation, I'm selling hot dogs through my corporation. And the corporation would also, by the way, own an insurance policy. It would be that corporation that could be sued, and I can't be. Now, let's think about it in terms of the church. Back 100 years ago, local United Methodist churches, there weren't a lot of corporations. Instead, they were what were called unincorporated associations. And under most state laws, it meant that they could only own real estate in one way, and that was to form a board of trustees. Sound familiar? And it was the trustees that actually received the deed. We'll talk about deeds a little later today. The trustees owned the real estate, and the trustees ran the church. And here's the ticket. The trustees were almost always people of means in the community. Why? Because if the unincorporated association did something, was somehow responsible for an injury to a person, somebody came to church and fell on the steps, It was the trustees individually who had to pay compensation to the victim. Well, that also is not a particularly helpful way to do ministry. I don't want my biggest givers to on the hook personally for a slip and fall in my local church. And so what happened in the United States was we extended this corporate idea to the nonprofit world, to various organizations doing charitable work, to local churches. Now, local churches can also file articles of incorporation. They've been able to do this for, 75, 80 years. They could file articles of incorporation as a nonprofit corporation. That's what most states call it. I think it's what Louisiana calls them. They file the articles of incorporation, and now the local church exists as a corporate entity. Its members, its officers, they are no longer personally liable for injuries that the church might cause. Instead, it's the local church itself. And you may think, oh gosh, well, that's bad for the church. Yes, but it's better than it being the individuals who go to church there being responsible. And now the church as a corporation owns an insurance policy, owns the real estate, owns all the stuff in the church, pays the employees. You give money, they own the bank accounts. And when you give money, you are giving to that corporation, that nonprofit corporation. Now, but we're United Methodists, and we have a lot of small churches, and we have a lot of small churches that have been around for 150 years. And my guess is in Louisiana, like in Missouri, you probably have some small churches that have never done that. And I get asked the question sometimes, should we? And generally the answer is, yeah, you should incorporate, but understand that means you're also going to have to make sure you amend your real estate documents, your deeds, to make sure it's the corporation that owns it. You're going to have to change your bank account over to the corporate. It's a lot of work. Is it good? Yeah, it's a good thing. Is it absolutely necessary? Well, nowadays where we have good insurance, as long as the church has good insurance, there have been some court cases in various states that have kind of protected local churches that weren't incorporated. But generally, it's a good thing to incorporate. And if you're wondering, has my church incorporated? I don't know the answer. You can find the answer. You can go to Louisiana's Secretary of State and you can search the records. I put the website here for you. And I would suggest that you play around with the Louisiana Secretary of State's website and search for your local church and find it and see, are we incorporated? Usually when you incorporate as a nonprofit corporation, it requires you to file either annual, sometimes biannual every 2 years. You got to file reports with the Secretary of State and a filing fee. Usually it's like $20, $25. You do that to notify the Secretary of State who your officers and directors are. Typically, statutes require that a nonprofit corporation have bylaws. In my experience, most United Methodist churches, even if they filed articles of incorporation, they don't have bylaws. And what they say is something like, we have bylaws, it's called the Book of Discipline. I get it, and that can work, it's okay, but have you read the Book of Discipline? If you have to bring that into a court as your bylaws, it's going to be confusing to the judge and to the jury because the Book of Discipline's complicated on a good day. What I recommend is working with your annual conference to come up with a set of bylaws that refers to the Book of Discipline and says it governs if the bylaws conflict, refers to conference standing rules, but gives some basic framework that a court can easily understand. I don't know about in Louisiana. I can't help you with bylaws in Louisiana. Your annual conference might be able to help with that. I keep a template for Missouri churches, but I can't, I'm not licensed in Louisiana, so I can't do that, but it gives you an idea. And I want to be clear, all this corporate stuff, it is corporate law, not tax exempt law. Just because you're a nonprofit corporation doesn't mean the IRS recognizes you as tax exempt. And quite honestly, just because the IRS does recognize your organization as tax exempt doesn't necessarily mean you're incorporated. They are distinct, but related. Tax exempt status is actually governed by a section of the tax code. It is you may have heard of this. It is 501c3 of the tax code. This is a part of federal law. It's part of the Internal Revenue Code. If you were here this morning, I talked about the Internal Revenue Code, Chapter 26 of the U.S. Code. 26 USC 501c3 governs certain tax-exempt organizations that are charitable in nature. And the definition of charitable includes religious organizations, and the IRS has extended that to include churches of all sorts, churches and other religious organizations. So here's a key concept. Your local United Methodist Church is tax exempt no matter what you have done. If you have incorporated, it is tax exempt. If you haven't, it is tax exempt. If you have filed for a tax exemption, it can be tax exempt. Even if you haven't filed for a tax exemption, it's tax exempt. However, it may be that you have a donor, especially corporate donors, who are very interested in seeing evidence that you are tax exempt under 501c3. And they may be interested in that because another section of the tax code, section 170, says donations made to a tax exempt organization under 501c3 are deductible as an itemized deduction on an individual's income taxes, and also deductible for corporations on corporate tax returns. And so it is possible for organizations to obtain recognition of their tax exempt status, explicit recognition of their tax exempt status. I'll talk about this in a minute. For most tax exempt organizations, that is going to mean they have to file for it. And you file for it on a form called a 1023. It is I think 25 pages last I looked, a multi-page application. You have to say some certain magic words in that application. You got to get your charitable purpose right. It's a little bit, you got to present projections for financials and 3 years of budgets. It can be a little complicated. However, there is no need to do that as a United Methodist Church. And I'm actually going to change the screen that I'm sharing and share with you a different screen. We in the United Methodist Church have what is called a blanket letter ruling or a group letter ruling. Our General Counsel on Finance and Administration several years ago applied for what's called a group letter ruling. And the idea is this: if all the organizations within a group are affiliated and related, if they are part of a denomination as a church, then they are entitled to apply as a group to be recognized for all the individual member organizations to be recognized as tax exempt under that letter ruling. And GCFA did this many years ago. And you can actually get, if you have a corporate donor who says, I need to see your 501c3 determination letter, you can say, we don't have an individual determination letter. We're covered by a group letter ruling, a blanket letter ruling. You come to this website, gcfa.org, and then you click services, go to legal services, and then you go to group ruling right here, okay? And it pulls this up, and you see GCFA has automated the process of obtaining the group ruling 501c3 documentation for your church or other United Methodist organization. And you click below. You can click here, and it takes you to this website. You need to know, what is your EIN? It's called your employer ID number. It is your local church's version of a social security number. You do have to have that. Then you have to click the type of organization you are. For a local church, it's church. If you're a DS or a district staff, it's district. You see? Sometimes charges are together. They have a single employer ID number. Two church share it, and they share a bank account. You can do it as a charge or a parish. And then you have if you have a United Methodist men or United Women in Faith, and they want, in your local church, they want a copy of it, they can also apply as an organization. There are a handful of other United Methodist organizations, although that they used to be more than it is today. You click the kind of organization you are, you click you're not a robot, you click submit, and assuming you have a GCFA number that is tied to the right EIN, within 24 hours, you will have generated for you your group letter ruling, and you will receive it electronically. It is a very handy tool to be aware of for your local church. I'm going to go back to my slide. Get back to, let's see here. So that it's the same, this is actually, I had the wrong website in here. It is gcfa.org. Although I think you probably can get to it with this one too. I think the UMC website points to it. So that's a blanket letter ruling. And here's the key, the question about 990s that came up. Churches in a group letter ruling are entirely exempt from income tax, but they are also not required to file any form of tax return. Most organizations that get an individual determination letter through that 1023 I talked about, once they have that, they then have every year to file a tax return called a 990. And if they do the 990, everything is great. They may not owe, a 990 doesn't mean you owe tax. In fact, it means probably you don't owe taxes at all, but you still have to file it. Organizations in a group letter ruling have a huge advantage because GCFA files the 990 on your behalf and includes a schedule of all the local churches. And I've seen it. It is this thick, literally a paper listing local churches in the United Methodist Church that are part of the group letter ruling. So if, however, you have filed some local churches for various reasons, especially if they're a little more sophisticated, they're doing some ministries that maybe are kind of on the edge of whether or not it would be part of the United Methodist group letter ruling, they may want their own tax determination letter. And you need to talk to your annual conference, because let me tell you, in our disaffiliation world that we exist in, going to get your own group letter ruling might be viewed by your conference office as a step towards disaffiliation, because disaffiliated churches are no longer in the group letter ruling. It is one of the things they will have to do if they want a determination letter. So it could be taken as a sign that your church is thinking about disaffiliating. If you want to get your own determination letter, you need to do it in conversation with your district superintendent and your annual conference office, especially the treasurer's office. And if you do that, if you get your own, then you do have to file a 990. It's not a super complicated tax return, but it is obligatory if you have an individual determination letter. We're going to talk about the 990 process becomes more complicated. And even if you're in the group letter ruling, you may have to file a special form of the 990 called a 990T if you have something called unrelated business income. And I'm going to talk about that when I start asking the question, is a church always exempt? And the answer will be sometimes they're not exempt. So a couple of things. Once you're in, whether it's through the group letter ruling or your own determination letter, once an organization is a 501c3 organization, you have to, again, we're going to go back to that section 170 that I talked about earlier of the tax code that allows deductions for gifts to the organization. 170 also has this concept called private inurement. What is private inurement? Here's the idea. Your local church, your tax exempt organization, applies whether you're a church or not, but your local church, it can provide reasonable compensation to your staff, to your pastor, to other staff, whatever that staff is, as long as the compensation is reasonable. And reasonable is pretty broad. reasonable compensation can be pretty high if the church can afford it. There are megachurch pastors making a lot of money. However, what the church can't do is allow any of the assets or the financial benefits of the local church to flow to an insider, a leader, whether lay, clergy, staff, volunteer. It can't go to that person except as reasonable compensation, except as taxable income. Some examples. The church takes up a love offering and gives it, just pulls cash out of the plate and gives it to the pastor. Never reports it to the pastor, never reports it on the pastor's W-2. It doesn't get reported anywhere. That's private inurement. Because it may be that the love offering was not so big that it probably still would comply with reasonable compensation, but reasonable compensation has to be reported as compensation on a W-2. Here's another one. Let's say you have a board of trustees and one of the trustees owns a business and the church gives a contract to that business. Maybe it's a construction business. Now, reasonable compensation says the church, yeah, that's okay. It needs to be disclosed to leadership. That trustee probably should not be voting on the decision. And the price the church pays has to be the market price. But if the church says, hey, we're going to take care of our church member, we're going to pay more than what he would have charged to another customer. That's private inurement. That's a violation of federal law. So you have to be careful. And this happens, this slides under the surface of local churches all the time for exactly what I was just talking about. Leaders in the church sometimes have businesses. Sometimes those businesses can be beneficial to the local church. But you have to be careful not to run afoul of private inurement. You cannot, here's another thing, you cannot, it is not a tax-deductible gift for one individual to say, church, I'm giving you this money and I want you to give it to such and such a church member. Gifts for individuals are not taxable, but neither are they tax deductible. And in fact, I would keep your church out of that business entirely because it starts to look like private inurement very quickly. If a person says, I want to give a gift to a person through the church, the answer to the individual that wants to give the gift is, it would be best to give the gift directly. It's not tax deductible, even if you give it through us. Benevolences. Churches can give benevolences. There's nothing in the law that says it can't be a staff person. It could theoretically be a staff person. However, that is really ambiguous and gray. I get it. If a staff person has a house fire, I get it. But and maybe there are going to be situations when it is okay. But here's the key to giving benevolences. The church needs a written benevolence policy and an independent decision maker within the local church to give those benevolences. It might be a threshold amount. You might say to the pastor, Pastor, here's our benevolence policy. As long as it's to a non-member and as long as it is under a certain amount, say $500, the pastor can decide to give the benevolence through the church office. This happens all the time. People come into local churches seeking assistance. The church I served, it was in a very wealthy zip code in St. Louis County, in suburbs of St. Louis. And that said, it was a very wealthy zip code, but in the neighborhood right around the church, there were a host of struggling families financially. Most of them had houses that they couldn't afford. And we had a handful that had families that had some addiction problems that were regular. They needed help with utilities. And so we had an adopted written benevolence policy. Once a year, a person could get assistance. Non-member, had to be a non-member. I had authority. I don't think it was $500. I want to say it was $250. I could give $250 of church assistance, and I could authorize it. And my business administrator would simply cut a check to the person, or in some instances, even give cash. If it was more than that, if it was more than once a year, if it was to a member or a member of the staff, I had a subcommittee of my finance committee that was the benevolence committee, and they had to make the determination, and I was cut out of the process. That kind of policy, that kind of formality, that kind of intentionality, churches can give benevolences, and it's not taxable. It doesn't get reported as income to anyone. You don't have to give the recipient a 1099. It's a straight up benevolence, but you need a written policy. I'll tell you, you know who doesn't have a written benevolence policy? The Missouri Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, our office, and sometimes we get folks who come in. I don't want to take a benevolence policy for the conference office to CFA or to our mission council, or even worse, to our session of annual conference. It's too complicated. And we're an office, we're not a church. It's not the same thing. So what we do have in place is we have a little fund that some of us contribute to individually, and our receptionists or our administrative assistants can give bus fare to people or cab fare to people, very small amounts, okay? And it's funded all of us by individually, so it's not the conference's money anyway. So those are some ways, but if you cannot just straight up give money that isn't reported as taxable to your pastor, especially to church leaders. It is a bad idea because it looks like private inurement. Reimbursable expenses. I said to any pastors who were on this morning, I said, you have got to submit receipts for things you get reimbursed for. They need to be itemized. And you have to have a purpose, a business purpose. It's the church's purchase, not your purchase. For you who are on this afternoon, here's the key to avoiding private inurement. The adequate accounting. You have to get an itemized receipt before you cut a check for a reimbursement for a professional expense. The pastor or the staff person needs to tell you what the business purpose was, why they were spending money on behalf of the church. And continuing ed, it can be a broad, indirect relationship, but continuing ed needs to relate some way to that person's role on staff. Now, I have a really expansive and generous view of this. If somebody wants to take a writing class in my office, they can do that and we'll reimburse it. Why? Because writing skills are important for all of our jobs. If they want to do something ministry related, even if it's a little outside their area of ministry, I'm going to pay for it because I want our people to be well educated and well-rounded as people. But it needs to have some kind of connection. It can't just be underwater basket weaving. So I got asked in one of these sessions once in another place, well, what about like hunter ed? And I said, no, that's ridiculous. And I'm a hunter. No, they said, but my church is a rural church. It is critical that I participate in these activities, and I don't have a clue. Well, maybe that, then all of a sudden I've said, maybe actually you can. You might, as long as your church is documenting and you are able to state what the business purpose is, it can be reimbursed. But anything that's outside, any reimbursement that you make without the itemized receipt, without the statement, you are putting the church at risk for private inurement. And the worst penalty for private inurement is loss of tax exempt status. Suddenly, a church would have to file a tax return, a corporate tax return, and pay tax on its income. You do not want that to happen. So avoid private inurement. The other thing that 501c3 tax exempt organizations have to avoid, politics, but not all politics. 501c3 organizations are not allowed to participate or intervene in campaigns for candidates. Local churches can do all the issue defining they want, as long as the issue isn't too tied to one candidate, which gets tricky sometimes. You cannot endorse a candidate. Your pastor cannot get up in church and say, everybody go vote for John Smith. That's participation in a campaign. It's intervention in a campaign, and it's a violation. It made big press actually a few years ago. It was called the Johnson Amendment. The amendment was to Section 501c3 of the code when it was originally passed. And the Johnson was Lyndon Johnson, who was in the Senate at the time. Now, pastors do have their own First Amendment rights to free speech. They can go out and they can campaign for people, but they need to be clear. I am doing this, and they need to say it out loud to people they're talking to. I am not endorsing any candidate on behalf of whatever United Methodist Church I'm serving. That church doesn't endorse a candidate. I am working as an individual. They have to be clear about that. We've had a couple of pastors who wrote columns in local paper. If they write it and they have their job title under their name, that's a bit of an issue. Here's an issue. I have a church that allowed a candidate for office. It was a city council position to simply use space in the church rent-free. And the problem is that the candidate, who was under some fire for ethics issues, went sort of more than they needed to and actually disclosed the use of the space to the state as a campaign contribution from the local church. That's a violation of the Johnson Amendment. That's an endorsement of a candidate. You cannot do that. I would recommend to sort of, Jesus does this in the Gospels. He builds a fence around the law, around Torah. You know, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, anyone who looks at another person with anger in their hearts has so much as committed murder. Like, murder's not just the physical act of killing, it's thinking about killing someone too. The same with this. Put a fence around it. I'm not saying don't involve the church in some issues of the day. There are some very important issues across the spectrum of conservative to progressive. There are issues that maybe the church wants to speak into. And as long as there are issues that aren't identified with any particular party or any particular candidate, they're fine. An example here in Missouri, we went through a ballot initiative for Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And it passed. And lots of our churches, even some of our more conservative churches, because there were some very outspoken Republicans in Missouri who wanted Medicaid expansion, they participated. And it was fine because it was a ballot initiative. There was bipartisan support and opposition to the initiative. It wasn't tied up with any party or any candidate. That kind of initiative is fine. Our churches spoke into it and did it well. You just have to avoid candidates. And so don't take up an issue that one candidate has made his or her main issue. Don't take that up, because that's going to look like you're just endorsing that candidate. Candidate forums. Be careful with candidate forums. They're generally fine as long as every single candidate has equal access to the forum. You cannot invite just one political party's candidate to come to the church to talk. If you invite one, you have to invite them all, and not just the Republican and the Democrat. You got to invite the Republican, the Democrat, the Green Party, the Socialist Party, whatever party is in the race, you got to invite them all. They all have to have equal access. Now you're taking a more balanced position, but I tend to tell my churches I would avoid candidate forums because there's just too much risk. You can do some lobbying in your state legislature or in the federal legislature. However, there are limitations on what can be spent on it. It's kind of hard to get to the thresholds, but assuming you're not making it a mainstay of your local church's life, you can do a little lobbying. I myself have gone on behalf of the annual conference to testify against a bill that was before our state legislature a couple of years ago. It was fine. How much did it cost the annual conference? I don't even think I asked for mileage for it. Our capital is only 30 minutes away. I didn't ask for mileage. I spent a little time, That was all it was. So it was pretty easy, and it didn't cost us anything. That kind of lobbying is absolutely okay. And I will say, I did it at the request of the bishop. He was on board with what I was doing, and we talked extensively about it. So churches can do some lobbying. You just have to be careful about it. Okay, I'm going to pause here and take us off of screen sharing and see if there are any questions. We're going to stick with this, but I am going to shift gears a little bit. Okay. I will go back to the screen. So I've talked about 501c. I've talked about corporate law, forming a nonprofit corporation. Good idea. I've talked about how our local churches as nonprofit corporations are also 501c3 federal tax exempt organizations. And I'll add, and I think in all states that have state income tax, if you're federally exempt, you're also exempt from state income tax. Now I want to talk about funding, and in particular, tax deductible donations. 501c3, under section 170 of the tax code, 501c3 organizations are allowed to receive gifts from individuals or in corporate donors too. And especially for individuals, they can be deducted from the individual's income tax. Now, it's an itemized deduction, gotten a lot harder to take itemized deductions, but you can still do it. However, the law is crystal clear. There's been case law on it. There's been IRS revenue rulings on it. It is crystal clear. For that deduction to be valid, the church must have given a contemporaneous written acknowledgement. Now, for churches, it can be a giving statement given at the end of the year. They've made that concession. It has to provide a description of the gift. So the amount, or if it's an in-kind donation, the value of the donation, the name of the donor who gave it, the name of the church to whom it was given. And it has to have this statement on there that it was no goods or services were given in exchange for the gift, except, quote, tangible, intangible religious benefits. There is case law that says if that statement is not on your giving statement, the individual donor loses the donation, loses the deduction. And people have been audited, and the IRS took away the deduction because it wasn't there. And in the worst case I've seen, the couple that took the deduction, then lost the deduction, went to the church and said, the statement, we needed the statement on there. The church printed off a new giving statement with the statement, and the IRS said, it is too late. It had to be given contemporaneously. Make sure most church software, if you're using church software for your giving, it'll have it on there automatically. It'll print it on there because it's so ingrained in the world of church finance. But you have to give that acknowledgement. If somebody's given over time, if it's a church member, you can do that giving statement. But here's what I'd recommend. If someone, especially if they're not a church member, if someone just says, hey, I'm going to give you a large donation just because I think you're important to this community. This happens sometimes. Somebody will give a donation to a church, not part of the church, but they like what the church is doing in the community. Or if they support some ministry area. So if the church is running a feeding shelter or a homeless shelter, or they may give a gift to that ministry, even if they're not part of the church. For those, especially when they're larger, over $250 is the threshold, but especially for really large ones, don't do a giving statement. Do an immediate letter with all the right language, all the requirements. Do that giving letter and give it to them immediately. You can give them a giving statement at the end of the year too, but make sure they get that letter up front so that it's contemporaneous, okay? And all giving statements to your regular givers, they have to be done by January 31st of the year after, right? So you're looking back. So for 22, you had to have them done and out to the members by January 31st of 2023, okay? All right, now I want to talk a little bit about times that local churches, they are tax exempt organizations under federal law, but sometimes they are not exempt. And this is I'm going to do a couple of these, and then I'm going to give you a little break to stretch your legs and maybe use the restroom. Okay. Churches are not exempt from payroll tax. Now, what are payroll taxes? Well, payroll taxes are really comprised of three things. First, for any lay employee, you are obligated to withhold the employee's estimated income tax from their paycheck based on their W-4. A W-4 is a form they fill out with the payroll office, with you or your payroll company, and it estimates how much you need to withhold for their income tax. It's the way the government gets paid as it goes, okay? Yeah, I see we're not exempt from sales goods. I'm going to get to those. So a local church is still an employer in the eyes of the IRS, and it has to withhold the estimated income tax. Now, what about clergy? Clergy are exempt from all withholdings. The local church doesn't have to withhold anything. Notice I say doesn't have to withhold anything. If you have lay staff in your church and that you're already withholding and paying forward with, we'll talk about it on the 941, a clergy person appointed to the church can fill out a W-4, mark it as exempt, but in the additional amount withheld, they can estimate how much they need to pay for both income tax and Social Security and Medicare tax, and have the payroll withhold that from their paycheck. It gets sent in with the 941, and they get credit for it on their tax return. They either have to do that or they have to pay quarterly. And if you have lay staff, it is so much easier for a pastor to have a withholding just like everybody else. So do that for your pastors. If you have questions about it, I guarantee your conference office can help you with it. That is a common question in local churches that goes to your annual conference offices. Payroll taxes also fund Medicare and Social Security. And for lay staff, that's FICA and Medicare. The total is a 7.65% withholding from the employee, and then the church has to match it out of church funds with another 7.65%. That's 15.3% total. The estimated withholdings, FICA and Medicare, it all gets bundled together, and the tax return's a 941, and you send it into the IRS, and the individuals get credit for it on their tax returns. The pastor is exempt from all those, and a pastor do not withhold FICA and Medicare tax on a pastor. They are exempt from FICA. They pay self-employment contributions, even though they're employees of the local church. I'd encourage you to watch the section 1. If you weren't there, I think it's going to be recorded. Watch this morning's session where I talk extensively about that. They're exempt, but they can do that voluntary withholding, and it credits both income tax and social self-employment contributions, Social Security and Medicare funding. Okay. If you have, I don't know if Louisiana has this, Missouri does. If you have an unemployment insurance program in the state, most organizations have to also withhold or make a contribution for that unemployment insurance. In Missouri, at least, and I think in a lot of states with those unemployment programs, churches are exempt. They don't do it. However, Missouri has this little-known statute that says churches are supposed to notify employees in writing when they're hired that they're exempt from unemployment. So you may also have to withhold unemployment, which gets paid to the state employment agency. Okay. So you are not exempt from payroll taxes. I've already talked about this and the voluntary withholding. I think I'm about to shift gears and talk about clergy W-2s. I'm also going to talk, somebody made a comment about sales tax and property tax. That is a state-specific issue. And you may or may not, in Missouri, it is possible for a local church, a tax-exempt organization, to apply for a sales tax exemption. So you get a certificate, you take it to Walmart, you take it to whatever store you're shopping at, and they'll knock off the sales tax for you. And it is also possible, it typically happens automatically, the local church's property and parsonage are typically exempted from property tax rolls, and you don't pay property tax either in Missouri. Although even in Missouri, Louisiana may not have the same exemption. I don't know. But in Missouri, even if a church has their property exempted, but they own property across the street that's just vacant, or they're renting it to a for-profit, it's no longer exempt on property tax, and you have to pay that too. So just be aware, there may be some other taxes out there that are state specific. Yeah, see, Louisiana has no exemption for sales tax on goods or services. So sorry, Louisiana, you're stuck paying sales tax. All right, I am going to stop here, and let's take, what time is it? Let's take an 11-minute break. So let's come back at 1:40, and we'll have about 50 minutes left of our presentation time. Sound good? All right, I'm going to turn my Okay. Let's see, I have exactly 140. So we will jump back in here. Let me share my screen. So we have talked about payroll taxes. And let me say a quick word about clergy W-2s, because this does relate to payroll taxes, at least indirectly and in some ways directly. So I just said that clergy are entirely exempt from withholdings unless they do a voluntary withholding. So on a clergy W-2, and you'll have these slides, so you'll be able to see them. This is guidance. Boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the W-2 on a clergy person. Only clergy. And how do you define clergy? By the Book of Discipline. The IRS defers to the United Methodist Church's definition, to whatever denomination's definition. So if you have lay supply, they are not exempt from the withholdings. And I know that's hard because usually lay supply are serving our smallest churches, and therefore it's very difficult for those churches to do the withholdings. But clergy, they are exempt from FICA and Medicare, and 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the W-2, and I'll show you a W-2 in just a minute. They're blank or they get zeros. Box 2, which is federal income tax withheld, has a 0 unless they've done a voluntary withholding. And don't worry about this. The clergy person can have you withhold enough to cover both income and their self-employment contributions on their 1040, but it all goes in box 2. It is only treated on the 941 for purposes as a federal income tax withholding. And then I get asked this a lot by folks, where does housing income appear? We pay a housing allowance. We know it doesn't go in box 1, which is where the rest of the income goes, but where does it go? Well, it doesn't have to go anywhere. You don't have to report it. It's the clergy person's responsibility to add it into the 1040 on their Schedule SE, because they pay self-employment contributions on it. And it doesn't appear anywhere on the 1040 sections related to U.S. income tax. And you can, however, and it can be helpful, report their housing allowance or how much you paid for utilities on their behalf in box 14 with the designation, the note housing. And then I get asked this also a lot, United Methodist Church, if you got a clergy person, I think it's box 13, you are going to check retirement plan. And then you've got some box 12 amounts and codes that are helpful. Any contribution for pre-tax contribution to PIP gets a code E. PIP Roth contributions get a code BB. Group health contributions are made, get code DD. So here's a W-2. This is a secular W-2, not a clergy person's W-2. And you can see that. And I talk about this in the morning session as well. So I'd encourage you, if you missed that, you could take a look there. I do a little more in depth on a clergy person's W-2. You can see here, this is a lay person. They're a secular employee. It's called the big company. And you see the normal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the amounts. You'll note that even a secular employee may have a different amount of income that gets taxed for FICA and Medicare than they do for federal income tax. There are some things that are exempt from income tax that aren't exempt from Social Security and Medicare. Down here, you've got the local designations. So this now I couldn't change the template for it to say the big church. My staff tried and we couldn't figure out how to do it. We pulled this off the internet. But you will see 1, 2 have amounts. They have a voluntary withholding. This is intended to be a clergy person's W-2. And 3, 4, 5, and 6 are left blank. You see retirement plan is checked. You've got some amounts. And then the local stuff is down here as well. So that's a very quick, and again, I spend a lot more time on W-2s in the morning session where I was sort of talking about clergy tax specifically. Now, I'm going to do a little interlude here because this is a very common local church question around who can get a 1099, who gets who is an independent contractor versus who is an employee. So, and here's the key difference. Employees must receive a W-2, and that includes the pastor. They're an employee by definition from a court case that the IRS that the IRS prevailed in. They won in the tax courts. So all employees of a local church get a W-2. Independent contractors, as all of you on this Zoom probably know, or they get a 1099. But sometimes there's ambiguity. And here's this is complicated because the IRS doesn't have a hard and fast rule. Instead, they have what they call a facts and circumstances test. You look at multiple facts and circumstances. And here are the key ones that have appeared in court cases that the IRS says they look at. And I'm going to add that the IRS, I went to a presentation a couple of years ago in which the director of tax exempt organizations at the IRS said they were undergoing an initiative to sort of increase the enforcement around payroll tax, withholdings, and W-2 versus 1099. And I can tell you, I felt that. We haven't had an independent contractor questioned yet, but we have had multiple churches have their 941, their payroll tax returns questioned by the IRS, and a couple had issues that we had to help them correct. So between an independent contractor and an employee, first question, who controls the schedule? You hire a lawn guy and the lawn guy gets to decide what day to cut the grass. That person, that lawn guy, is probably an independent contractor. They're not under direct supervision. You must be here at XYZ time. If your person is scheduled, they may still be an independent contractor, but they look a whole lot more like an employee. Is it a service the church ordinarily provides? Is this normal for you to provide this service? So like lawn care, well, I don't know. I mean, it's not really, that's not the church is not in the grass cutting business. And so to hire a lawn guy, it looks like you would do that with a contractor. On the other hand, childcare, well, in a local church, if you're requiring nursery workers to be at the local church every week from 8 a.m. to noon on Sundays and Wednesdays for choir practice and Sunday night dinner from 4:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. that looks like an employee. That they don't control their schedule, the church does. And childcare is a normal service that the church does provide for its members. It's not temporary and unique. It's ongoing, regularly scheduled services. That makes it look more like employment. Who controls the work quality? Is it somebody working for another person, like a lawn guy that has another boss somewhere? Or is the quality of work controlled by the local church? Local control looks like employment. It's not determinative in and of itself, but it looks more like employment. Who provides the tools and equipment? So tools and equipment, the lawn guy brings his own mower. He sets the schedule. It's not something the church would ordinarily provide. It just needs it because it's got a lawn. That looks like an independent contractor. On the other hand, again, nursery worker or musicians. If the musician is required to be there at set times, especially, if it's not a pianist or an organist, if they're bringing their own instrument, maybe they could be a contractor. But the pianist and the organist, the church provides the equipment. They provide the space. They tell them when to come. I can tell you almost always, organists and pianists, when it goes to court on these issues, they are almost always determined to be employees, not independent contractors. How's the person paid? Again, not determinative in and of itself, but if it's an hourly wage or a salary, that looks like employment. If it's a fee, that looks more like an independent contractor, the HVAC guy. Are there benefits? If there are benefits, that looks like employment. And the question I get, is there a safe harbor? Yes. Employment is always the safe harbor. If you're unsure, make the person an employee, put them on your payroll. So I'll give a couple of examples in my office. I'm not in a local church. I'm in the annual conference office. So I'll do childcare for the annual conference. We in the annual conference provide childcare exactly one time a year, and that's it. And that one time of year is when? The session, right? We provide some childcare for the kids of our members. We do it one time. We either hire a service or we hire individuals that we know. And I have an agreement with them. We sign a contract in which they acknowledge it's temporary work. It's only 3 days long. It's only for a limited number of hours. It is not a service that the annual conference typically provides. And therefore, the agreement says we have the relationship of an independent contractor and not employment. I'll also add, they bring their own equipment. They actually bring their own supplies, and they roll those into what they charge us to provide for the services. So that looks more like an independent contractor. Whereas in a local church, the same nursery worker, especially if the church is providing the diapers, the toys, what have you, and they're there every week, all for 52 weeks a year, that looks like employment to me. All right, let me pause to see if there are any questions. Let me jump back to talk a little bit more about clergy and specifically compensation. And this is all you see. Now we're moving further and further away from corporate law and tax, but we're still in that area. So I really just wanted to make sure that everybody understood a couple of things. Clergy compensation gets divided up, and there are multiple forms of it. There is obviously the cash salary, the taxable, that goes on box 1 of the W-2. It's the cash paid to the pastor. It's also like if you do the after-tax contributions to PIP or the Roth contributions, that all gets reported as income to the pastor, even though you withheld it, because it's an after-tax contribution. There's also housing, which is income tax exempt, but not exempt from self-employment tax, but that's up to the clergy to figure out on their tax return. There are some other amounts that are withheld before income taxes, like pre-tax PIP contributions. PIP is a 403B plan. Group health insurance premiums. It has to be to a group plan. No more giving a stipend to people and then treating that as tax-free. You can give them a stipend, but it's taxable. And they can probably use it for whatever they want. Amounts paid, contributions paid for CRSP-DC, CRSP-DB, the defined benefit portion of our pension, CPP, which is our death and disability plan. That's all kind of in the realm of clergy compensation, some of it taxable, some of it not. But here's what's not clergy compensation. And I've said it already, they're professional expenses and they're continuing ed, because those are amounts paid on behalf of the local church. Okay. In the vein of when churches are not exempt. So they're not exempt from payroll tax. You all have helped establish churches in Louisiana aren't exempt from sales tax. There is no exemption. In Missouri, there is. You're also not exempt if the church engages in certain activities that result in income. And all the gifts given to a local church, that's tax exempt income. But income from a, quote, unrelated business transaction, that's not exempt. And the church may owe income tax on it, specifically a tax called the unrelated business income tax. It's a straight up 21% tax, excise tax on that kind of income. And it's always been complicated, and it got a lot more complicated in 2018 when Congress implemented tax reform. Here's the ticket. What is unrelated business income? Well, the good news is most churches don't have it. Even if they do some activities that are on the line, it won't apply. It's income from a trade or business that is regularly carried on that is not substantially related to the charitable, educational, or the religious purpose that is the business of the organization's exempt purpose. So for a church, that's worship and religious education and development, right? So here's some examples, and I'll go through more. Income from a trade or business regularly carried on. If you do a one-time fundraiser, it's not really regularly carried on. If you do a pumpkin patch, the pumpkin patch is probably not going to be subject to UBIT because it's not regular. You don't do it all year. It's a fundraiser for your youth group or a mission trip. However, if the church is operating a thrift store and they're selling used clothing, that's a trade or business regularly carried on. That could be unrelated business income. May still not be, but we'll get to that because there are some exceptions. To pay your UBIT, you have to file a tax return called a 990T. I've already talked about that, but there are some exceptions. You may have income from a trade or business that's not related to your typical exempt purpose. However, income from rent on property that's not encumbered doesn't count. It's not. So if you own your parsonage outright, you can rent it to a third party. The rent doesn't do anything to your tax exempt status, and it doesn't qualify as unrelated business income. It's perfectly fine for you to do that. You do need to have a charge conference. You do need to talk to your DS about doing it before you do. Income from sales. Let me give a counterburst. If you go out and your church to finance ministry buys homes and you borrow money on those homes, and they're all encumbered and you're renting those and the rent is offsetting the mortgage enough to still turn a profit, that's unrelated business income. On the other hand, if you have a building and you rent space, you may owe property taxes to your local county, or in Louisiana, your parish assessor, or Missouri, your county assessor, but it's not unrelated business income because it's rent of space. But the IRS has been very clear about one thing. If you own a parking garage, that is not rent. Even if you call it rent, it's a fee. It's a fee for a service, the service of parking your car. That's not rent. Parking fees are in fact unrelated business income and subject to UBIT. Okay. Another exception, any income from a sale that are A, carried out primarily by volunteers, or B, that consist primarily of donated items. So all of a sudden the thrift store is a little more, maybe it's okay, especially if you're staffing it with volunteers only, and especially if it truly is donated items only. Now, if you're going out and buying stuff and selling it, now you're into UBIT. There's no way to avoid it, and it's the whole operation that would be subject. So I list some pitfall. Again, it's 21%. It is not meant to be scary. And in fact, you may decide, hey, we're going to undertake this ministry because we believe in it, and it may be subject to unrelated business income tax. The answer to that is don't do the operation, don't do the ministry. The answer to that is let's get an attorney and a professional CPA who specializes in UBIT to help us make sure we file the right returns. Again, you just need to know. It's not a reason to say no. You just need to have the knowledge of what's going on to say, hey, I think that may be subject to unrelated business income. Some pitfalls. The rummage sale that gets out of hand. I had this in the Missouri Annual Conference. We had a church, had a regular rummage sale. It started out as a kind of a one-time fundraiser, and it went like, it was a huge success. And they started to say, well, let's do this again next month. And then all of a sudden it was once a month, every month for 12 months of the year. But it was still staffed by volunteers. It was all donated items. The church was donating the stuff. Well, then they started running short on donated items, right? Because it was too successful. So one of the members started going out and buying CDs, like used CDs that they then turned and sold at a profit. They hired someone to oversee it. And all of a sudden, that is now in the realm of UBIT because it's not donated items and you have staff overseeing it that are paid. I said this already, parking lot and rental space, parking lot space, and also like storage rentals. The IRS says, nope, storage units, that's not rent, that's payment for a fee. Rent is about occupancy, either for organizational business purposes or for living purposes. T-shirt sales. I had to declare in the Missouri Annual Conference, we were not going to ever sell t-shirts at annual conference. We wanted to, could have made some money doing it. It's subject to UBIT. Magazine subscriptions, if you are published in a magazine or you're selling books, it might be subject to UBIT. You got to be careful with that. The good news is, even if you're required to file a 990T, you may not meet the threshold. You got to have at least $1,000 of income. There are several deductions that can be taken on it. You may not meet the threshold to owe any money, but you need to be aware of it. Volunteers regularly selling refreshments on Sunday that would benefit their missions or program within the church. So this is a case in point, right? If you are just doing volunteers, if it's like a bake sale, no problem. Bake sales are fine. If you've just, even if you've bought the items, if you're just staffing it with volunteers and you're serving those refreshments and selling them to support missions, probably not subject to UBIT. But if all of a sudden you hire a staff person to oversee the volunteers and you're buying the items that you're selling, and you're doing it every week, that looks to me like it could be subject to UBIT, and you may need some advice on that. Okay. See, get back. Another word about 990Ts, and I don't typically cover this, but because I was asked about 990s, I'm going to go ahead and say it. So when you're calculating UBIT, you have to silo the income so if you're operating more than one unrelated business. And this is typically in larger nonprofits. However, it could happen to a local church if you've got a rummage sale that gets out of hand, plus you're renting parking spaces. You have to silo the income, and it's based on this North American Industry Classification System. It's a set of code numbers related to industry. And so, for example, rental income has one NAICS code, and retail, which would be more like a rummage sale or a thrift shop, that has a separate NAICS code. And you would you'd count those incomes separately and have to pay UBIT on both of them. So it used to be that you commingled them for your 990T, and then you could offset it all with the same deductions. And oftentimes you could deduct enough you didn't owe tax. Now, some of your costs may only eliminate the UBIT on one silo, and the other silo that doesn't take as much of that doesn't get as many of the deductions, it may end up yielding a tax. So you have to, these are extremely complicated rules. And if you think you have this, I strongly encourage you to obtain an attorney in Louisiana to make sure that you guys are doing it right. Again, I think any kind of investment, and this is becoming a little bit more common. I got a church right now that's engaged in some office sharing. We've got lawyers all over it. They own an office sharing space, and the church rents from that office sharing space. And it's a combination of a for-profit business and a tax-exempt organization. It has been complicated. It's tricky. We've needed really good attorneys involved to make sure that we stay in the good graces of the IRS. Okay. All right, let me pause there, see if there are any questions, and check my time. We got about 30 minutes left. Just a second to ask questions and get a drink of water. So that's kind of my presentation on corporate and tax for local churches. You're not exempt from everything. You got to pay payroll tax. You might have unrelated business income tax. You may have some state sales tax, property tax that you have to worry about. You got to pay attention within those to how the clergy are being compensated, how you're doing their tax forms, how you're reporting to them. And you are exempt, and so have a little bit more. You're able to take tax deductible gifts, for example. So that's kind of what I have covered so far, and that's the big chunk of my presentation today. From here on out, it'll be a little bit shorter and a little bit quicker, but I want to cover some common, what I think are common things that come up in local churches that I get asked about a lot in my role in the Missouri Annual Conference, and so I suspect you may have some of these issues come up as well. The first is the Fair Labor Standards Act. And it made big news at the end of President Obama's administration. They changed some rules. It made big headlines, and then it promptly got undone by the courts. The Trump administration came in and said that the courts were right, and then the Trump administration, about midway through its time, adopted remarkably similar rules that tweaked it enough to avoid the court challenge that had been made. So it was a lot of politics around a policy that both parties really thought probably needed to change. What I'm going to present today is where we are today with the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the truth is, even what changed, even though it made big headlines and got challenged, the truth of the matter was it wasn't particularly significant and didn't change that much, especially with respect to local churches. And here's the lens I want you to look at this through, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Most of your local church employees are going to be covered, and most of them are going to be non-exempt, meaning non-exempt means you have to pay them minimum wage, whatever that is in the state of Louisiana. And second, if they work more than 40 hours a week, you must pay them time and a half for the hours over 40 that they work. That's the rule. If they have an exemption, you don't have to do either. You can pay them less, you can pay them a salary, and they never get overtime. I can tell you my position with the annual conference, I am very clearly an exempt employee. I get a set salary, and believe me when I tell you, I don't get any overtime for hours over 40. But most employees, especially lay staff, are not going to be exempt, and we'll see that. So first of all, to be exempt, you have to have a set exemption, and there are a handful. Executive. Now, these folks have to make an awful lot of money, more than most churches are paying. Administrative, where we're going to spend most of my time talking about, that's the one that could apply in a local church. Professional might apply in a local church. The key there is they have to have a professional credential. So if they have a job description that requires them to be a CPA, a lawyer, or have some kind of educational credential, like a certain degree, then maybe a professional would count, okay? I actually think, we're going to see in a minute, clergy have their own, but I think clergy could qualify as a professional exemption as well. Computer employees, which tend not to work in local churches, outside sales, which definitely, unless you have a big old unrelated business income tax issue, you don't have outside sales in the local church. Or if there's not, those are set in the statute of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Those exemptions exist. However, you have to have one that you could have one that courts recognize. And one of those is an exemption for clergy. And while it hasn't been applied that much to the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal courts seem to be increasing the number of jobs that could count as, quote, ministerial, and therefore exempted from a host of federal laws, presumably including the Fair Labor Standards Act. However, that hasn't been decided in court, and you do not want to have to litigate to get an answer, because you're going to spend more litigating than you would just paying an employee time and a half if they work some overtime. But the Department of Labor seems to recognize the clergy exemption. Those exemptions, especially, we're going to focus on the administrative. They are determined by the job description, by the education requirements, and this is key, actual compliance. You can't put a job description in place that you're not actually following. So I've seen this in churches. They say that the administrative assistant has supervisory authority over staff and a budget, but then in reality, it's the pastor and the administrative assistant can't do anything. They just put it in the job description so that they didn't have to pay the administrative assistant overtime. You can't do that. You have to actually comply with the job description, okay? The statutory exemptions, especially the administrative one that could apply to local churches, they require a certain threshold of income to apply. So they have to make, and this was the big difference. The Obama administration had, I think it was about $8,000 more of total annual income to get into the exemption. The Trump administration came in a little lower and made some other tweaks to avoid the court challenge. So they have to make at least $35,568 annually to be exempt, which is not, it's a fairly low threshold, but it used to be like $20,000. So it's much higher than it used to be. That said, you got to beware because salary is irrelevant if you don't have the right job description and actual compliance. So let's talk about administrative employees. I don't mean administrative assistants. It does not mean administrative work. There's a very specific definition in the statute. And I said it already, they have to have supervisory authority, a budget, they have to supervise other employees. They got to be able to make a decision without authorization from someone else. In short, these folks are managers. They manage an area of work for the organization. So some illustrations. Maybe you have an executive, maybe not if they're clergy, they're exempt as clergy, but maybe you have an executive, kind of an executive office type manager. If that office manager actually has authority over a couple of other administrative assistants and over the office budget to spend without authorization from anybody, that doesn't mean not without oversight. They may be overseen, but that they have authority to do that budget themselves, and they make $35,000, whatever it was, that they are an administrative, they can be exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. If they don't have actual supervisory authority and they don't oversee a budget themselves, if they don't supervise other staff, they're not exempt. You have to pay the minimum wage and overtime if they work more than 40 hours. Let's get some examples here for you in the church. The choir director. First of all, ministerial, it's never been decided. I don't think you want to litigate to figure out. Some church probably will at some point. I don't think you want it to be your church because it will be a simple lawsuit is at least $50,000. I don't know that they're ministerial. They may be, they may not be. Are they professional? Well, that's going to depend on the job description. But that said, most of the time, a musician is not recognized as a profession. They're not like a lawyer or a CPA, an accountant. However, if you actually require them to have ordination or commissioning or licensing, now they're back in clergy. They could also be professional, but now they're clergy and they're clearly exempt. But here's where I think most of, at least in the churches I've served, and we had a choir director, if we got them exempted, here's how we did it. They had authority over the musicians, over the pianist and the organist. There was a chain of command. Yes, the choir director answered to the pastor, but the choir director supervised the pianist, the organist, and other musicians. The choir directors I've worked with actually had hiring and firing authority. They had that supervision. And they had authorization to spend in the music budget without anybody else signing off on it. And they always have gotten paid more than the threshold salary. So a choir director might be ministerial, but they can also pretty easily fall into the category of an administrative employee, as long as you don't have a pastor who wants to micromanage and sign off on every single decision. They could be administrative. Youth directors. Well, here's the problem. If they're not required to be licensed, commissioned, or ordained, they may not qualify as clergy. They might be ministerial, but it's never been adjudicated. And oftentimes, in my experience, youth directors, maybe like in a large church with a large youth group, oftentimes they might have some supervisory authority over other staff or a budget. But I often work with youth directors who had small youth groups, and actually I, as pastor, had to sign off on all their expenses. That makes them not look like an administrative employee at all. They don't look like a manager. They look like they answer to someone else. It is possible that you have to pay a youth director. And in fact, my advice is, if you're on the fence, make them non-exempt, make them comply. They fill out timesheets, they get paid an hourly wage over minimum wage. If they work more than 40 hours, they get overtime. And then I always get asked, but what about mission trips? They work 24 hours a day. That they should not work 24 hours a day, even on a mission trip. That's unhealthy. That's horrible. When they're asleep, they are not working. They also need to have an adult volunteer group big enough that they can get some breaks. Now, do I think you're going to have to pay some overtime for a mission trip? Yeah, they're probably going to put in 50, 60 hours. But that doesn't mean they put in 100 hours. They need breaks. They need time away from the kids. Quite honestly, believe me, as a former youth pastor, that's a good thing to get breaks on a mission trip. So just be aware of that. You may have to work with staff to schedule in ways that a church isn't used to scheduling. Okay. If you're not exempt, you got to pay minimum wage. You got to pay overtime. I get at, what about comp time? Fine. You can give comp time, but it's got to be in the same week. So if somebody gets their 40 hours Monday through Thursday, they can take they can take Friday, Saturday off. That's fine. Not a problem. They're under 40 hours and you can make them take those days off. However, if you allow them to work, even if you didn't know that they were going to go more, if you allow it, it counts as overtime. If you let them go over. So in the conferences, my annual conferences, employee handbook, employees are strictly forbidden to work more than 40 hours a week. If they're not exempt, they are forbidden to work more than 40 hours a week without their supervisor's approval and without my approval. Both supervisor and I, as conference treasurer, have to sign off on it. So we make sure that nobody goes over 40 hours unless there's a good reason for them to, and sometimes there is. Okay. This is all to say you need a good written policy about your work week, when it starts. Well, you can set the work week anytime. In the Missouri Annual Conference, the conference office has a really weird work week. Our work week is Thursday to Wednesday. Why? Because we have some weekend activities that we make people work, and then I can make them take off Monday and Tuesday. So you need to think about and have a good policy around all that. And this is the last thing I'd say about the Fair Labor Standards Act. Remember that it was created not to punish employers, but to pay people fairly. And as United Methodists, we have a commitment to human beings. Don't take advantage of your employees. Don't run them into the ground. Make sure they're only working 40 hours. And if they're working more, it's only fair that you give them a little overtime. This is about fairness to people. And I think it's important to keep that in front of us. When the changes to the FLSA came out, everything was about how it was going to be so hard for employers. I get it. That's true. There's truth in that. But let's also remember that it's about fairness to employees and asking people to do things that are reasonable and not unreasonable. Okay. Well, let's do some case studies real quick in the time we have left. Let's look at a Parents Morning Out program. And let's just do some issue spotting. So a preschool or a parent, you know what these are, right? A church runs a preschool, part of the church, part of the ministry, great. They have a staff that runs it, okay, taking care of the kids. Well, first of all, on staffing, you got to remember the Fair Labor Standards Act applies for all those employees. If they have to have a clear exemption or they're subject. So maybe you have a director that can hire and fire the the preschool teachers or the Mother's Day Out staff, and maybe they oversee a budget. But other than that director, almost always preschool teachers and Mother's Day Out workers, they're non-exempt. They have to get minimum wage and they have to get overtime if they go over 40 hours. You can't just pay them a salary. I see this all churches say, well, we just give them a salary. It doesn't matter how you pay them. They have to get at least the minimum wage for the 40 hours they work. And if they go over 40, they have to, and I don't care how you pay it out. You take the 40 hour, you take whatever you paid them for the week, divide it by 40, That's their hourly rate. Be wary about making those folks independent contractors. Those staff, if they are regularly required to be there on a set schedule, they're probably employees and they need to get a W-2 unless you have essentially engaged a service to provide childcare on those days where the service is bringing all the diapers and all the toys in. But generally, churches have those and provide those supplies, and that makes them look like employees. There are also issues around preschools with corporate structure that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So a preschool, if there is no separate corporate entity, mark my word, the preschool is just the church. If a child is harmed in the preschool or the Mother's Day Out program, it is the church's liability. It does not matter if they have a separate preschool board. It does not matter if they have a separate bank account. If there's only one corporate entity and only one insurance policy, there is only one organization that can be sued and be liable, and that's the local church. Can you make it? Can you create a corporate structure? Yes, you can create a corporate structure where you actually have the preschool as a separate organization that is ultimately renting space from the church. And maybe that corporate entity, you form a separate nonprofit corporation, you capitalize it, you fund it, you open a bank account, you hire everybody in the name of that corporate entity that is the preschool, and you pay them out of that corporate entity, and you sign a lease with the church, between the corporate entity and the local church, to use the space for the preschool, even if the rent is nominal. If it doesn't, you're letting them do it. Now you have two separate corporate entities, and now if a child is harmed, the church may be better protected. But I get asked all the time, is that what you recommend then? And my answer is not really. And the not really is because the maintenance of two corporate entities is typically too complicated for local churches to handle. Because if you don't do any one thing, a court could say, sorry, I know you're pretending to have two entities, but you're really just one, and disregard the second corporation. That happens all the time in courts because courts are looking for ways to compensate people who have been harmed. So what my only advice with respect to preschool and Mother's Day Out on corporate structure is actually to not try to split these two options. Either just make it part of the church and clearly own it. Apply all the church's policies, have good staffing policies in place, have good policies to protect the kids in place, have a good insurance policy, and make sure your insurer knows you're running a preschool or a Mother's Day Out program. Nothing wrong with that. It's great ministry, and it's worth the risk, especially if you're mitigating it with good policies. If you do go down the path of separate incorporation, you got to maintain all the formalities, separate EINs, separate bank accounts, separate insurance policies. The preschool has to be well funded. It has to have money in its bank account and assets. It has to have a clear lease with the local church, even if some of the leadership overlaps between the two entities. So this is my thing, and this has come up with Boy Scout troops. It's come up with local churches. Either a church owns a ministry and runs it, or it doesn't. Don't mix. Don't have a situation where the church leaders are not capable of mitigating risks in a particular ministry, where you've got a separate preschool board that doesn't answer to the church council, but you're just using the church's employer ID number and bank account. Don't get in that situation. The church owns it or it doesn't. And I would say this, if you have a situation where you do have that unhealthy mix, that's a call to your conference office to get some help, because it can be really dicey. You're probably going to need the conference treasurer and the DS to help you untangle some of that. Okay. All right, just a couple more topics, and I know we're about out of time. Let me talk about real estate. Let me give you a lesson in real estate really quick. So ownership of real estate is really owning. In law school, they call it a bundle of sticks. And each of the sticks represents a right or a privilege and sometimes an obligation. So you own a piece of real estate, a piece of land. You have the right to build on it. You have the right to sell it to someone else. You have the right to rent it to someone else. You have the right to enter it, to be undisturbed on it. You've got several rights. Those rights together, if you have all of the sticks, all the rights and privileges of a piece of real estate, you have something that the law calls fee simple title. Okay. Well, it's possible to have some sticks, but not all the sticks. And that means you have less than ownership. You have less than fee simple title. This is true in a lease. If you lease you own it and you lease it, what you're doing is you're taking the sticks related to the right to enter and maybe be undisturbed on it, and you're giving it to another person in exchange for a monthly amount called rent. It is possible to sell a piece of property, but hold back a stick that says, if you ever do X, Y, or Z in the next 30 years on this property, all the sticks revert back to me. That's called a reversion clause, a reversionary interest. If X happens, I get the property back. These sticks, they are transferred. If you're transferring ownership, they are transferring it with a document called a deed. And a deed is a public document. It gets recorded by a recorder's office for all the world to look at so that everyone knows Joe Smith owns this property. And the property will be described as a legal description. And that's a technical description that surveyors and lawyers and realtors work with on a regular basis. Well, deeds come in different types. There is a quitclaim deed and a warranty deed. In a warranty deed, you're saying, here are all the sticks, and I really own all the sticks. I got them. And I promise you that when I give you this deed, you will own them. You're making a warranty. You're making a promise. There's also a quitclaim deed. And a quitclaim deed just says, if I own this bundle of sticks, I'm giving it to you with this deed. But there's no guarantee that I own those sticks. So I tell people, I'll give a quitclaim deed. Just give me the legal description for the Empire State Building. I will sign a quitclaim deed over to you for it. You will not own the Empire State Building, but neither will I have made any promises to you about that. Okay. If I own the Empire State Building, then you would own it with that quitclaim deed. So who owns the United Methodist Church? A United Methodist Church. And is it in fee simple? And the question is, it's complicated. United Methodist Church, we have in our deeds, we have this document, we have this line called the trust clause. And the Book of Discipline says, even if it didn't get in the deed, it's implied in the deed. And most states, I won't say all, but most states have upheld that, and that works. And the trust clause says this: you church, you local church are getting this real estate, but you are promising that you will only use it for the purpose of United Methodist worship and United Methodist ministry. And if it ever ceases to be used for that in your ownership, the conference trustees get all the sticks. So in our recent disaffiliation issue, a church that disaffiliates, if we did not have in the Book of Discipline this paragraph 2553, a church that simply says, we're not United Methodist anymore. They have now stopped United Methodist worship. And under the trust clause, in a state that recognizes the trust clause, the conference trustees step in and they get ownership. And so it is why the General Conference had to do something to allow churches to leave the denomination with their property. Because in most states, if they tried that without that section of the discipline, the conference trustees would have a claim on their property. It is like sticks are being held back. I see a question. and filling out legal forms that require an owner to be listed, who would you recommend, the pastor, trustee, or treasurer? So if it's asking for the owner of the real estate, you're gonna have to look at the deed, and it's who the deed names as the owner. It is never, I have never seen a deed in the name of the pastor. The pastor is not the owner of the church's property ever, and do not ever think that the pastor is the owner. It is not ever the treasurer, not the owner. If you're incorporated, it's the name of the corporation is the owner. However, if the deed was transferred 150 years ago, it's probably going to list the trustees, the board of trustees. It's them as an entity as the owner. So it's going to depend. You're going to have to look to see what's on the deed. For financial assets and personal property, the stuff in the church, the owner should be the corporate entity, or the church as an unincorporated association, or the board of trustees as an entity. Okay? Never the pastor, never the treasurer. We don't own those things. Okay. Sticks are held back even without the trust clause. The Book of Discipline gives the district superintendent and conference some of the sticks related to a United Methodists ownership. One is, if you're going to lease the property for more than 30 days, or if you're going to go borrow money and secure it with the church, you got to get district permission. There's a whole process for doing it. And so they are all of those. It is not really, I would not say that a local United Methodist Church owns its property in fee simple. It's more complicated than that. So I see we're out of time. A couple of more things that I could talk about that don't typically come up. You do have to pay attention to zoning and building codes in your locality. You may have some of those. Oftentimes you may have an exemption as a religious institution, but not always. And if you change ownership in any way, if you do some kind of deed to transfer the property, sometimes it can trigger things like required building inspections or a necessary change in zoning. You got to be careful about that. So at least be aware that they exist. Building use policies and agreements. The last topic I'll talk about, and I'll do it very briefly. If you're going to rent space to an outside organization, you got to be clear. You need a document. Your conference office can probably help with it. You need some kind of document that is clear on what's being used, how much the church is being paid. Remember, it doesn't affect your tax exempt status. You can get paid. What space is being used, and then the condition of it. And then this is key. Tenants of a local church building, they need their own insurance, and they need to, what it's called, indemnifying the church. They are saying, if somebody gets hurt on our watch, we'll protect the church from any liability. Okay. So I know we're out of time. I know I kind of got cut short there, but let me pause quickly. And see if there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope this has been helpful for everybody. And I don't see any questions. Could I do this? Could I pray for you guys? And then I'll turn it over to Chris to kind of conclude. Is that good, Chris?
Perfect, Nate.
Let me pray for you all. Our gracious God, we give you thanks for the day and our time together. We give you thanks for new learnings and maybe review of old learnings. We give you thanks for your church in the United Methodist Church, and we pray your blessings on its ministry and in the future. God, give us strength for the days ahead. Some of the things that we're dealing with are hard and stressful. We have a lot of chaos. God, we know that you stand among us. You offer us peace, and we desire that our mind be the same mind that it was in Christ Jesus. Help us to be humble servants, to find ways to say yes, but to do so wisely and shrewdly. Pray for each of these individuals and their families, and I pray all these things in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Nate, thank you so much for your time. This was awesome. And if y'all missed anything, like I said at the start, we recorded it. It will be posted on our website next week. Nate, thanks again. We really appreciate your time. And we'll start up in May with Diane Wilkinson traveling around the state. best practices on church administration, church leadership. So when you get a chance, go on and onto our website and sign up and register, and we'll buy you a free lunch. And thank you, Diane, again for your time in advance for helping us out. Hope everybody has a great weekend, and we will talk to you soon. God bless.